This video is brought to you by NordVPN. For the last few months or so, we've been tracking polling on how the UK feels about Brexit. A steady majority of Brits regret leaving in 2016, but as we've mentioned in previous videos, until recently most didn't want a second referendum on the issue. However, polling by Retfield Wilton from the end of April suggests that for the first time, a majority of Brits are also in favour of a second referendum sometime in the next 5 years. Now, previously, we've been pretty dismissive of the idea that the UK could actually rejoin the EU, not least because the EU don't seem too keen on it. But given that a majority of Brits now want to reopen the question, and that new voters are now overwhelmingly keen on rejoining, we thought the topic was worth revisiting in a bit more detail. So, in this video, we're going to have a look at how the UK's attitude on Brexit has developed over time, the most recent polling showing that most Brits want a second referendum, and whether the UK could actually end up rejoining the EU. So, let's start by looking at how public opinion towards Brexit has soured since the result in 2016. Every couple of weeks, YouGov has done a poll asking people in the UK, in hindsight, do you think Britain was right or wrong to vote to leave the EU? Since October last year, wrong has held a 20-point lead, with about 55% saying Britain was wrong to leave the EU and just 35% saying it was the right decision, with the remaining 10% or so as don't knows. This lead opened up as the UK economy was being driven into a ditch by arch-Brexiteer Liz Truss, but has basically held steady since then. The latest YouGov polling from mid-April says that 53% think Brexit was wrong, including about 20% of 2016 Brexit voters, while 33% think it was right. Now, when presenting this data, YouGov and other political commentators have been keen to stress that this doesn't necessarily mean that the UK wants to rejoin the EU. After all, thinking Brexit was a mistake isn't the same as wanting to rejoin. You might regret what happened in 2016, but also not want to reopen old political wounds, especially because rejoining would probably require a second referendum, which could just be as chaotic and divisive as the previous one. However, Retfield Wilton polling from early this year found that 55% of Brits are now in favour of having a second referendum sometime in the next 5 years, while just 24% of Brits are against the idea. Unsurprisingly, most Remain voters want a second referendum, while most Leave voters don't. Although it's worth saying that, according to the latest polling from April, 30% of Leave voters are in favour of a second referendum, compared to 50% of Leave voters who oppose it. So you get the idea. Not only do a large majority of Brits regret leaving the EU and would vote to rejoin in a second referendum, but now a majority of Brits also want a second referendum. So this brings us on to the second part of this question. Could the UK really call a second referendum and potentially rejoin the EU? Well, in the near term, no. Almost definitely not, because neither main party is interested in the idea. The UK has enough problems as it is, and both the Conservatives and Labour are essentially scared of even talking about Brexit, let alone a second referendum. Rishi Sunak doesn't like talking about Brexit because the right wing of his party don't think he's Brexity enough, and Starmer doesn't like talking about Brexit because he's afraid of upsetting Brexit voters in the Red Wall, who traditionally voted Labour but switched to the Conservatives in 2017 and 2019 because they didn't like Corbyn and wanted Brexit done. However, looking to the medium/long term, whether the UK could eventually have a second referendum depends on two things: how UK attitudes towards Brexit develop and how the EU's attitude towards the UK develops. Let's start with UK attitudes towards Brexit. Essentially, a second referendum is only possible if more and more Brits start calling for it. And this will probably only happen if anti-Brexit sentiment continues to grow. Essentially, for there to be sufficient political demand for a second referendum, the number of people who think Brexit was a mistake has to continue to grow, and rejoining the EU has become a political priority for some of those people. Now, there's no guarantee that this happens. According to that YouGov polling, the number of people who think Brexit was a mistake is sitting pretty stable at about 55%. And it's possible that, as time goes on, people just get bored of Brexit and less interested in rejoining. This is sort of what happened in Switzerland. In 1992, Switzerland voted by a tiny 50.3% majority not to join the European Economic Area. But as time went on, the Swiss got used to life outside the EEA, and the Swiss today have little appetite for closer relations with the EU or the EEA. On the other hand, young people overwhelmingly regret Brexit and are in favour of both a second referendum and rejoining. To give you a sense of quite how pro-EU young Brits are, according to polling from ITV from the beginning of May, 86% of young people aged 18 to 25 want to rejoin the EU. Assuming that their opinions don't shift significantly as they get older, as these new voters enter the electorate, they might increase demand for a second referendum. The second thing is how the EU sees the UK. As things stand, there's zero chance the EU would entertain the idea of the UK rejoining. The EU has basically stopped accepting members for the time being, and it's going to have its hands full for the foreseeable future as it tries to bring Ukraine into the bloc. It's also worth saying that the EU would only consider accepting the UK if it could be sure that the UK wouldn't decide to do another Brexit down the line. And it's unlikely that the EU would offer the UK the same preferential treatment it enjoyed when it was in the EU before 2016, which might make Brits think twice about rejoining. So you get the idea. Britain rejoining the EU is essentially impossible in the near term, and it could only happen in the long term if EU membership becomes a political priority for the British electorate, and if the EU can find the political bandwidth to incorporate the UK into the bloc, which would be no easy task. All in all, it's improbable, but not impossible. So we were invited to Downing Street, where we were briefed on the government's anti-fraud plan. As part of this, we found out that more younger people have fallen victim to online scams than over 35s. And as our analytics frequently tell us, our audience skews younger, which means that you're likely in this age bracket. So if you want to protect yourself online, you should try NordVPN. NordVPN has a bunch of tools that keep you safe. First, they have a feature called Threat Protection, which protects you from malware, trackers, malicious ads, and phishing scams. But that's not all. NordVPN also has dark web monitoring services, which, even if you somehow do fall victim to online fraud or scams, notifies you if your details end up online, so you can promptly change your passwords and keep yourself protected. And what's more, if technology isn't really your thing, don't worry. NordVPN offers 24/7 customer support and even a 30-day money-back guarantee for all users. So check out our link in the description to get your discount on their 2-year plan, plus 4 extra months on top of that. Thanks for your support.